Hello again and welcome to another Modi and Glory Warhammer 40k tournament after action report. That's right, it's time for some more dispatches from the front lines, and I am really excited for today's video because for the first time in a long while I took my pure infantry guard army out into the competitive scene. And let me tell you guys, it did not disappoint at all. I don't want to give too much away already, but all I'm going to say is by lasgun and bayonet, the enemies of the Imperium were laid low. And once more the galaxy learned the primordial truth, which is, it always comes down to an infantryman and his rifle. And with that said, let's dive straight into today's episode. As is tradition, I'd like to start off by saying a big thank you to the tournament organisers for setting up the event. This tournament was run by Team Stonehammer, and they're a really good group of guys, and they run some fantastic events. This is not actually the first Team Stonehammer event I've been to. I've been going to them on and off over the last few years, and they've consistently been of a really, really high quality. This is especially noteworthy as I've only really been in the tournament organisation game for about 2 or 3 years, and every single time I go to one of their events, they have improved the quality. They've taken feedback on board. So they're just doing it right. So massive thank you to Will and the rest of the Team Stonehammer lads. Really looking forward to your next event. And if anyone ever gets a chance to go to one of their events, be it an RTT or a GT, I highly recommend that you check them out. You highly recommend that you go because they just do a really top job. I also want to say a big thank you to the venue, Element Games, for, as always, being an amazing place to play games of Warhammer 40k. For any of you that have watched any of my tournament reports before, you've probably heard me mention Element Games. I go to a lot of events that are hosted at their venue, and it's always just really, really high quality. They've got a fantastic, huge, bunker-busting size gaming store. Their staff are always really knowledgeable and on point and incredibly friendly. They've got a fully stocked and licensed bar, so you can have a few brewskis while you're playing the games. Overall, it's just a fantastic place to go. Really large venue as well, able to host tournaments with 100 plus people at, which is awesome. And so overall, I just want to say, as always, a massive thank you to Element Games for not only being a great sponsor of this channel, but also for hosting another fantastic event, and as always, being absolutely on point with it. But with all that said, let's crack on with everyone's favourite part of these after action reports, the list review. So what was I actually running in my list at this event? Well, it was a pure infantry army, but you'll notice this one is very different to other pure infantry armies that I've run in the past. And that's because I was using the 9th edition codex at this event rather than the old and now obsolete 8th edition codex. Finally, an event that lets me use my nice shiny new guard codex. Now, the difference between the old codex and the new codex comes down to a couple of things, but the big one is I could no longer run big blocks of conscripts in my army. Conscripts are gone, they're not in the 9th edition book. That means you can no longer take 30 guardsmen in a single squad. It means that I'm essentially limited to taking squads of 10 infantry at a time. This change has fundamentally altered the way that I've been approaching my pure infantry armies, because now troop choices are at an absolute premium. Even in an Arks of Omen detachment, where I take troops as my compulsory selection, I still only get 12 troop choices. This means that if I just stick to using things like regular infantry, I'm only able to fit 120 bodies in my list. That is nowhere near enough to run a proper guard infantry horde. In previous iterations of my pure infantry armies, I've been running 200 or even 300 infantry, and I needed to start getting back up to those levels if I was going to have a chance of making this playstyle work. So I took a look at the Arks of Omen detachment, and I was looking for how many slots in that detachment, be they troops or elites or anything else, would allow me to take 10-man squads in it, because I'm trying to cram in as much line infantry into my list as possible. And it turns out that between the Allied Scion detachment, because I took one of those as well, and the main Arks of Omen detachment, I was actually able to get 18 slots, which allowed me to take 10 men in each one of those detachment options, which allowed me to get a total of 180 proper infantry into this list, which was a great start. It's not quite 200, but it is a good start. And so that was the basis that I built my list on. So now that you know the foundations that the list is built upon, the idea that I had going into the army, let's take a look at the specific units that I put into the list. So starting off with the main Arks of Omen detachment and beginning with the HQ choices, I took 2 Death Corps of Krieg Marshals. Some of you might be scratching your head or furiously checking your codex for that option. You won't find it in there. These are a Forge World option. They are basically exactly the same as a Cadian Castellan. They've got 1 wound less, and that's really it. But they cost 15 points less than a Castellan, which makes it significantly cheaper when you take these guys in your list than the Cadian Castellans. If you're never planning on using any of the Cadian stratagems or anything, you might as well go with Death Corps Marshals. And for my third HQ choice, I took a Dreadnought. Now, in case any of you are wondering what the hell a Dreadnought is, it's where you take a Cadian command squad and you give it the usual trimmings like the banner and the Vox and the Medi-Pack, and there's like 1 trooper spare in there with a special weapon, and the officer's got the power sword and the bolt pistol. But then you give the officer the Death Mask of Ollinus Pious, which gives the whole squad a 4% vulnerable save, and you then add in Nork Deddog as well as an Ogren bodyguard, and it just makes the whole thing incredibly durable when you start putting things like Nightshroud on it so it gets trans-hit, and then you can use Cadian stands on it so it gets transhuman, and then it's got a 4% vulnerable save and a 5 feel no pain, and Nork reduces all damage by 1. It's just an incredibly durable unit. It's basically a brick wall. And in my opinion, it's invaluable in this style of list because pure infantry is kind of fragile. You'll see later on that I built quite a durable pure infantry army, but by and large, it's not hard to remove 10-man squads. Even if they've got carapace armor like Kazakin or Scions, it's not that hard to remove 10-man squads. So having something in my list which is just a brick wall is invaluable because it gives me 2 tactical options. Firstly, if my opponent is throwing a really horrible, gnarly assault unit at me, and I need something that can just stop that unit in its tracks, even if it doesn't kill it, it can just stop it dead, I've got a Dreadnought there. It stops something like, Sanguinary Guard, although they're a little bit out of date now, but, some sort of traditional fast assault unit from rolling up a flank, I can stop it dead with the Dreadnought. The other thing that it's really good for is being an immovable object in the center of the board. This allows it to draw a lot of firepower. Your opponent will end up often getting tunnel vision trying to kill this thing, which is great because it's not killing her infantry. Or if you're like me and you take boots on the ground for one of your secondaries every single time, it's great to just move this command squad into the middle of the board and just sit there getting an extra boots on the ground point every single turn because it's got a banner. So it's a great way of scoring you secondary points as well. Last thing to mention about this command squad is I did spend an extra command point on it to give the officer superior tactical training. I did this using the officer Cadre stratagem, and by giving him superior tactical training, I was able to allow the officer to do Prefectus orders as well as Regimental orders. This is honestly one of the most underrated tactics that you can do in your guard army because it allows you to do Prefectus orders 24 inches away thanks to the fact that the command squad has got a Voxcaster, and also every squad in this army also had a Voxcaster. I cannot tell you guys the number of times that having 24-inch range, fall back and shoot, just saved my bacon. It is honestly a go-to tactic. It should be an auto-include in pretty much every single guard army. If you are ever finding yourself putting a Commissar in your list, don't bother. Save the 40 points and instead spend the CP to get superior tactical training on one of your command squads and do those long-range Prefectus orders. And the last HQ choice I took was a Primaris Psyker. Now, primarily, I took him to cast Nightshroud on the Dreadnought or other units most turns. But there were a number of games where I actually got to use his second power, which was Psychic Maelstrom. And let me just say, the Primaris Psyker is really overlooked by the community. Being able to have a 60-point unit just sit there and do a smite and a Psychic Maelstrom every single turn and put out an average of 4 or 5 mortal wounds is really, really potent. So I really enjoyed him. He was a very flexible unit and one that I look forward to including in a lot of my lists going forward. He's very plug and play. He can either do direct damage or he can buff. But the fact that he can now cast 2 powers a turn really improves his flexibility and really makes him a proper tool in the toolbox. So that covers the HQ. Now let's move on to the troops. And I took 12 squads of Death Korps of Krieg. Every squad had a sergeant with a Laspistol and Chainsword, double melter gun, Voxcaster, and a Medi-Pack. Now I know some of you are going to be surprised that I went for Death Korps of Krieg. Why didn't I go for Cadian shock troops, get that double plasma? Sure, those melter guns are a bit short ranged. Well, you'll see in a moment that I was able to get past the short range of the melter guns pretty easily. But also, the reason I took Death Korps of Krieg was pretty simple. I ended up originally starting off with putting loads of Cadian shock troops in here, going down the double plasma route, and I found that I had just maxed out a lot of my troop slots, and I had loads of points left over, and I started putting things in the list that I didn't really need. Like I started like chucking mortars in the list, but they weren't really having the proper support to make them work. There's no creed in there, for example, and I realized that I wouldn't want one of my senior officers babysitting my mortars. That means I've got to start thinking about putting like a commissar in there. Now I'm literally just wasting points going after a unit that I already wasn't that bothered about taking. So I actually looked back at my list and went, you know what? Rather than cramming more basically spare units into the army, which is just going to it's going to make it bigger, it's going to slow it down, it's not going to add much to it rather than just wasting time, why don't I go back over the 12 infantry squads I've already taken and see if I can upgrade them? And that's basically how I saw it. I upgraded from Cadian Shock to Death Korps of Krieg. And let me tell you, I am so glad that I did. In my humble opinion now, if you're running a pure infantry army, you need to go Krieg or you need to go home. It's as simple as that. They are deceptively durable. I literally had my opponents spending turn after turn trying to clear through these Kriegi bastards, and they never managed to fully do it. And it was so light and day when I had my opponent shoot a whole bunch of shots at a unit of Kazakim, who have got a 4+ save, meant to be the elite of the Imperium, and just pick them up without even trying, and then put the same amount of shots into a Death Korps of Krieg squad and them living, only taking like half casualties. The permanent mini transhuman is fantastic. The Medi-Pack is invaluable. Over the course of every game, I would say it saved me 30, if not 40 wounds. It was just that good. It's like taking an extra 2 or 3 or 4 infantry squads each game. And also, I didn't notice any loss in firepower taking the Krieg over the Cadians, because I put melter guns in every single squad. And let me tell you, 24 melter guns is a hell of a lot of firepower. So I didn't notice the loss in firepower in any way, shape or form, but I certainly noticed the increase in durability. Yes, I was paying a premium, but it was a premium that in hindsight, I'm incredibly grateful that I paid. Moving on to the elites, I took 3 units of Kazakin, and I'm going to be honest with you guys, I basically just took them as extra line infantry. I didn't try any fancy tricks like the Kazakin bomb or anything like that. I didn't have the Barbican's key or anything wacky like that. I literally just ran them as 3 extra 10-man squads that happened to have some extra special weapons in there. The loadouts I went for them were a little bit strange, but there was actually some tactical thought behind it. I gave each squad 2 plasma guns, a hotshot sniper, and 2 grenade launchers. Now, there were 2 reasons why I was giving them grenade launchers and not things like more melter guns or hotshot volley guns. The first reason was that I'd run out of melter guns at this point anyway. I'd given all of them to Death Korps Krieg. Sure, I could have maybe put some grenade launchers in the Krieg and brought the melter guns over, but that wasn't actually the way I was going to run them, because that brings me on to the tactical reason why I was running them with grenade launchers, is I was running these Scions as a bit more long-range support. They were often going to form part of a 2nd or 3rd wave. They were often going to be shooting at maximum range, at which point the melter guns wouldn't have been helping me. They often would have been out of range the way I was using these Kazakin. So the grenade launchers meant that at their maximum range, each squad was able to put out 5 high strength, decent AP, decent damage shots, because you've got 2 crack grenades coming out of the grenade launchers, you've got 2 plasma shots coming out of the plasma guns, and then you've got the hotshot sniper rifle. When you mass all of this together, you take all 3 squads in a bit of a Kazakin death ball, suddenly you realise that it's 15 of these very punchy shots coming out of this little Kazakin platoon, and that was really powerful, really punchy, and often did a lot more damage than either I or my opponent was expecting. And then the final thing in the Arks of Omen attachment was a single armoured sentinel. And this thing literally was in there so it could sit behind a ruin within 12 inches of one of my officers holding a home field objective and just get me 5 inflexible command points every single turn. It's got the squadron keyword, it is a vehicle, it's near one of my officers, it's getting me a victory point every single turn. It literally never fired a shot, it never did anything, it just sat there and scored me the points. In fact, it was so low priority in my own mind that I actually forgot the model both days of the tournament and had to borrow someone's Contemptor Dreadnought as a stand-in. So if you see a random Contemptor Dreadnought like in amongst my lines in the game pictures, don't worry, that's not some 4D chess flanking maneuver my opponent has managed to pull off. It's actually an armoured sentinel. Like I said, it just sat there to get me points. And the final part of the list was my allied Scion attachment, and this, guys, was very straightforward. I ran a Scion Death Ball. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Scion Death Ball, it's where you take a Scion command squad and you give the commander the Drill Commander Warlord trait, which means that all of your Scions get to fire their rapid fire weapons with maximum shots at maximum range. That means you get 4 shots from your hotshot volley guns at 24-inch range, 2 shots from your plasma, 2 shots from your rifles, just maximum DACA all the time. You then also put in that command squad the big bullshit banner, the finial of the Nemedesh first, so they ignore all modifiers and enemies can't use wound caps or feel no pains or anything like that. And so that's the command squad, and then you take 3 units of Scions and you give every single one of those Scions a double plasma and double hotshot volley gun, and if the plasma pistols and power swords are free, you stick those on the sergeants as well. And you obviously, of course, take Voxcasters. This thing is just brutal. Every single game that the Scion Death Ball came out to play, it deleted everything that it touched, and it became the most feared unit in my army against literally every single opponent. Every single person who faced off against Scion Death Ball went, whoa, that thing is bonkers. It is utterly lethal. Why haven't I heard about this thing before? I keep telling you guys, everyone's talking about Kasrkin. Everyone's saying Kasrkin are the big deal in the Codex. They're not. The Scion Death Ball is truly an S-tier tactic. And I can say without a shadow of a doubt that every single game, my Scions outperformed my Kasrkin. And they both had equal amount of support, essentially. And every single game, my Scions were the men of the match. No doubt about it at all. Now, I know some of you are going to be curious about what regimental doctrine I took. And I went for Swift as the Wind and Heirloom weapons overtaking Born Soldiers. The reason I did this is because I honestly didn't think I was going to struggle with damage output. And spoiler alert, I had no issue in the shooting phases. I genuinely did not miss Born Soldiers in any way, shape or form. Guys, I'm rocking 56 or more special weapons in this army between all the plasma and the Kasrkin and the Scions. I didn't struggle for damage output at all. What I predicted I was going to find tricky was the fact that all of my men only had a 6-inch movement. So by taking Swift as the Wind, that goes up to a 7-inch movement. And also that I was going to struggle with range, because whilst I've got a lot of special weapons, most of them are like melter guns, and they're only going to have a 12-inch range. So heirloom weapons gave me that extra pip of range, which meant that I was actually having 16-inch range melter guns. Combine that with the 7-inch move from the infantry, meant that my melter guns actually had a 23-inch threat range, which was really, really clutch. I actually found that if I hadn't had, in every single game, I mentally kept track of, would I have been in range this turn? Would I have got onto this objective this turn without my regimental doctrines? And I can tell you, every single game, I would have struggled to take objectives off my opponent. I would have struggled to get through dense terrain. I would have struggled to get my big guns, my melter guns, into range of my opponents. Honestly, I cannot recommend enough that if you're running a pure infantry army, don't just default to Born Soldiers. Start thinking about the weaknesses of infantry and look at regimental doctrines that let you get around those weaknesses. And for me, I felt like going with that extra movement and going with extra range really did plug those gaps. Now, before we dive into game number 1, I briefly want to talk about the lay of the land. What I mean by this is how competitive overall was the event. What was the terrain like? What were the lists like? And what was the player skill? overall, this event was pretty bloody competitive, alright? Starting off with the terrain, it was all L-shaped ruins, they were all preset terrain maps, it was all set to the WTC standard, where there wasn't a big, massive ruin blocking line of sight. There was dense terrain, reducing your ability to hit or slowing your models down. Pretty much the standard for UK serious tournaments at this point. There was no narrative terrain here in any way, shape or form. I do want to say well done to the TOs for the consistency of the terrain. Every single board had enough. There was none of this where half the boards got good terrain and then after that we start busting out the GW ruins from 3rd edition or anything like that. No, it was all top notch and there was all plenty of terrain for every single table. So that's really good. This kind of terrain does favour assault armies, because assault units are able to jump from one piece of terrain to the other, keeping out of line of sight before they can finally pounce on shooting armies. I knew that going into this tournament the terrain was going to be like this, because it's just a standard I've come to expect, and I knew that my first infantry advances were always going to get torn to pieces by assault units. That was just a fact of life that I was willing to accept. The way I combat around this terrain is by purposely throwing units forward that I don't mind dying, hoping my opponent takes the bait, they run in, they kill a bunch of creeps I don't really care about, and then the rest of my army steps out from behind cover and blasts them off the table. That's how I, as a shooting player, typically get around this assault favourable terrain. Now, in terms of the list that people were running, all of them were good. There was, as far as I could see, literally no uncompetitive lists. Oh, sure, there were net lists that people have put their own twist on. Like, I saw one Orc player with the Goth pressure list and he had a bunch of kill rigs. And I just saw another Orc player who had the Goth pressure list and he had a bunch of Squidhog boys, or whatever they're called. There's the same list, just a couple of units have been changed out. There were lots of Tau there. The Tau players that were there had Riptides and Crisis suits. There were lots of Marines there. Pretty much every Marine player was running Iron Hands. So there were a lot of very, very good lists there. And apart from one or two what I would describe as Johnny Rambo lists, a little bit like mine, where it's not a net list, it's not a traditional list, but it certainly is a powerful list that has a lot of play and thought and tactics behind it. Apart from the occasional Johnny Rambo list, pretty much all of them were one variation or another of a pretty standard famous online list. And finally, in terms of player skill, everyone there was pretty experienced. I think there was maybe one or two people that had come along with their friends and it was maybe their first time at a tournament, but their friends were pretty experienced tournament players. So the vast majority of people, I would say 90% plus, had at least one or two tournaments under their belt, if not a lot more than that. The player skill was very high, and rarely did I come across in any of my games any instances of people making silly mistakes or having to check things in their codex. In fact, I don't think at any point did any players in my games have to even check the codex. We just knew what our armies did. We had a rough idea of what our opponent's armies did. We kind of explained any gotchas at the beginning of the game, like I explained on Mini Transhuman, and that was really it. So overall, a really competitive event. I feel like because we're getting to the end of an edition, we're getting to the end of 9th edition, a lot of people who are still going to tournaments are the competitive people. I think when we see 10th edition come along, we'll probably see a bit of a revitalization and a bit of new blood being injected onto the tournament scene once again. But overall, I would say, or maybe it's the fact that 9th edition has just been the tournament edition, has been the competitive edition, and so at this point enough people are veterans of the competitive meta. It could be one or the other, we'll have to see, but certainly I have felt over the last few months that we have started seeing a homogenization, a standardization of the kind of players and the kind of play and the kind of lists that we see at events. It is becoming fairly routine going to tournaments, and it's pretty easy to know what to expect at each one. And so we get to game number 1, and I find myself playing against a lovely chap called Dan and his Grey Knight. The mission we're playing is the Scouring, which is a 5 objective mission, and it is short table edge deployment, which isn't really great for either one of us, because most of his firepower is 24-inch range, and most of my firepower is pretty short range as well. So both of us are going to be running into the center of the board, trying to capture those middle objectives and doing as much damage to our opponent along the way. Now, in Dan's list, the big part of it was 4 Dread Knights. He had 1 Grand Master and 3 regular Dread Knights, and then he just had a crap load of 5-man Marine squads. I think there must have been 30 or 40 strike Marines. Now, some of them were interceptors that can teleport around a little bit. Some of them were purifiers, but basically it was 5-man squads putting out some half-decent Dakka, and that was really it. Now, for deployment, I end up stacking a lot of my infantry behind 3 ruins that are in my deployment zone, and it really does give me decent line of sight blocking. Yes, there are some angles he can draw onto me, but he can't really concentrate all his firepower into one spot. Likewise, Dan takes all of his Grey Knights and he hides them behind his ruins, and as you can see, we basically have a little bit of a cage off, and whoever gets first turn isn't really going to be drawing a huge amount of line of sight to their opponent. Now, I deploy my Kazakin and my Scions behind the middle ruin, because my thinking is that whether Dan goes left or Dan goes right, I can move my elite units to counter, and then I basically put 60 other infantry on each flank. So 60 regular Krieg on the left, 60 regular Krieg on the right, all of my elites in the center. Dan deploys a couple of Dread Knights on each flank, and the majority of his infantry cram behind his central ruin. I think the idea for him was to send the Dread Knights to put pressure on the flank objectives, whilst his big infantry block moves into the center of the board and secures it. Now, Dan ends up getting first turn, and he goes for a cagey yet somewhat aggressive push. So he does try and get a couple of Dread Knights into the middle of the board, and he then tries to, in Psychic Phase, Gate of Infinity one of his Dread Knights over to put pressure on my left flank. Unfortunately, even with 3d6 and getting to add all of the dice together, because he had a stratagem that let him do that, he actually failed to get off Gate of Infinity even with a reroll. So that was pretty spicy. It did mean that one of his Dread Knights was left out in the open, but this was the Dread Knight that had the ability to, once per game, when you target it, it just blinks away, and you can't shoot it anymore. So he hadn't made a mistake there. He'd gone for a bit of an early push, but he had an insurance policy in his back pocket to make sure that he didn't just have a Dread Knight swinging its stick in the wind. He had obviously set himself up for a big turn 2. My turn 1 rolls around, and I kind of catch Dan off guard a little bit, because I'm able to get a lot of my weapons into range, and he wasn't really expecting me to get into range. A lot of my Kriegers move forward very aggressively. I'm willing, I'm sending the Dreadnought forward, and I'm sending my Kriegers forward because I'm trying to bait him into coming and getting me. And so what happens is, so my turn 1 is relatively uneventful. The only real damage that I do is I do blow up his Razorback, because it was a Twin Assault Cannon Razorback. He thought it was just a little bit of spare firepower. To me, Twin Assault Cannon is actually quite a decent damage output from him. So I got rid of the Twin Assault Cannon Razorback, and I managed to put several wounds on a couple of his Dread Knights, and I force him to use his blink, because I get a few melter guns into range on his Dread Knight that has the blink out in the open, and I force him to use it. So that's really important, because normally that's like really, really clutch, and I basically got him to use it just against, I think I put 1 unit of Kazakin out there to try and, I was willing to lose that unit of Kazakin if it meant that I got rid of that ability, and it worked, which is great. Dan's turn 2 comes flying in, and it's a big one. It's a really big one. And actually, and to be honest, and we'll come back around to this at the end, but it's a really big turn 2. All of his Dread Knights come flying in. All of his Marines come flying in. He really basically goes for the big push. And it is a successful big push, don't get me wrong. He does pick up, I'd say, sort of 60 Krieg, and he does pick up one of my units of Kazakin, the one that had exposed itself. But he is on the line. He is on the line. And so, and he also does manage to defeat the Dreadnought as well, but the Dreadnought absorbs his entire Psychic Phase, basically, because it was, I sort of intended it to go that way because I was banking on my, because I don't get my Krieg Medi-Packs against mortal wounds. So I was like, if the Dreadnought can absorb all the mortal wounds, then and I can bank on its 5+ feel no pain. That really works well for me. So between his shooting and his charging, he probably, you know, he kills the front rank of guys that go up there. It then comes back round to my turn 2. And in my turn 2, I do some really punishing damage. I kill 2 of the Dread Knights outright. I force another Dread Knight that had like a once per game 3+ invulnerable save to pop its 3+ invulnerable save, and I cut it down to like 4 wounds, even with that. And every single Strike Marine that is exposed gets picked up. Okay, because I bring the Scions out, I bring most of the Scions out. Some of them are still in reserve, and I bring my remaining Kazakin out. By reserve, I just mean behind the ruin. And so I probably kill 2.5 Dread Knights in one turn, and I probably pick up, if there's, let's say there's 40 Strike Marines, I probably pick up 20 of them. So I cut his army down in half. And unfortunately, and this is going to really come as a surprise, unfortunately, we ran out of time. And the game ended on my turn 2, which I know a lot of you are going to be going, what? What? How did you only get to 2 turns? Well, let me explain. Basically, it only got to 2 turns because we were very active in every single phase. And I don't want to, I'm not pointing fingers at my opponent in any way, shape or form here. He honestly played as quickly as he could. But realistically, guys, I only got one, I deployed, and I deployed before the round started because we got to, me and Dan both got the table ahead of time. So I deployed, I got a couple of movement phases and one realistic shooting phase. And that was kind of my involvement in the game. But I would say, going over, and I would say, again, there's no criticism of Dan in any way, shape, or form. He really did play as quickly as he could. And we both agreed that the game had been played as quickly as realistically it could have been. But unfortunately, I would say that his army was too active. It was too active in the movement phase. Everything had to be lined up very precisely for these turn 2 charges. And to be fair, he had to do that in order to get the most out of his army. I fully respect that. And then it had a very active psychic phase. I mean, every unit is doing a smite or some kind of power. And there's a lot of psychic, so there's a lot of dice rolls going off there. We're having to work out which units are close and all that kind of stuff. There's a very active psychic phase. And then there's a shooting phase in which he's shooting as much as he can in his shooting phase as well. And then there's a charge phase. And then there is a combat phase. So even if, you know, Dan only takes like 10 minutes in each one of those phases, 10 minutes for movement, 10 minutes for psychic, 10 minutes for shooting, 10 minutes for fight and charge, you're still looking at, 30, you're looking at, like, I'd say about 40 minutes for each round, which means that when he has 2 turns, and then we take, and then take into account there's like 20 minutes for deployment overall for both sides, we're probably looking at about, 2 hours getting used up there. And I honestly didn't feel like I did a huge amount in that game. Now, we did try and talk it out, but I honestly, I did say, Dan wanted to talk it out, and I said to him, honestly, it's turn 2. I think it's very difficult for us to talk out turn 3, turn 4, turn 5. I think realistically, you should, my personal rule is you should only ever really talk out a turn 5 if both players want to, and if it's obvious what the end result's going to be anyway. You can just be like, I'll move my models here. But the problem was that, Dan argued, well, he was going to hit me again turn 3. And I was like, yes, you will. And yes, you will pick up the remaining Kriegers, but you're still going to have majority of the Scions. You're still going to have about 40-50 infantry left. And you've realistically got 20 infantry and 1.5 Dread Knights left, of which you have no way of boosting their durability. So it could definitely, my turn 3, even with 40 infantry conservatively, Even if that's like, 10 Scions, 10 Kazakhin and 20 Kriegers. And then I'm going to have more than that as well. Do you know what I mean? Like, I am going to be able to realistically do a lot of damage back to you. So I said to him, let's get the TO over. Let's let the TO make the decision. And this is another great example of how on it the TOs were. They came over, they heard the story. They understood that both players were happy with how the game had gone. No one was complaining about timings from either side. I didn't complain about Dan's timings. He didn't complain about mine. He never once raised the point that I've got like 180 models or anything like that, because he knew it wasn't relevant. He didn't try and make that excuse to anything. Like I said, absolute top bloke. A less scrupulous player could easily have gone, well, he's got 180 models, and a less knowing TO would have gone, well, of course, that means it was the Gar player's fault. But Dan knew, he was honest, he said it wasn't. He said both players had motored as quickly as we could. And the TO basically said, look, if you both, it's turn 2, you both believe that you could absolutely win this game, so we're going to have to call it a draw. That way, both players are going to walk away without being, you're both going to be a little disappointed because you think you could win the game, but you're not going to walk away with a really bad feeling. Both players get to walk away with a little bit of dignity, and also you're not upsetting. No one's who's going to upset the leaderboard with that situation either. And me and Dan both said, I said, Dan, if you have to call it a draw, I'm happy to call it a draw. And Dan said, yeah, that seems the fairest way of doing it. And we shook hands, and then we went and had lunch together. So there was absolutely no ill feeling. We chatted, for sort of 10-15 minutes over lunch. And it was great. So there we go. So that was game number 1. Little bit of a damp squib, but let me assure you guys that every single game after game number 1, I did get to turn 5 without any issues whatsoever. So this is not going to be an endless tournament report, and then I only got to game 2. No, we absolutely did play out every other round of the tournament. Even with it being a short game, the lethality of the Scions was clear for all to see. In one turn, 2 Scions, just 2 guys with plasma guns, picked up an entire strike squad without even breaking a sweat. Because when I rolled the to hit dice for them, all of the 4 shots hit from the 2 plasma gun guys, but I rolled a couple of 6s, which meant that I actually ended up getting 6 hits, because Scions have got exploding 6s to hit. And then wounding on 2s with overcharged plasma, rerolling 1s thanks to the banner, means that they all wound. The Grey Knights don't get a save because it's AP -4, and it's damage 2, so they all died. And literally, I had this one turn where I split-fired my plasma and some rifles into one strike squad, and the volley guns and the remaining, and plasma pistol and remaining rifles into another strike squad. And I didn't have to roll my rifle shots because of how much exploding hits and how much damage I was doing, and I had put overcharged lad cells down as well. So it was brutal. So I want to say, like, even though it was a short game, guys, there was still a lot to be learned, a lot to be shown off, and the Guard performed very, very admirably. And the plan had worked. We'd absorbed the damage on the expendable troops, and the elites had done what they needed to do. So after the slightly damp, squib, false start of the first game, we got into game number 2. And this one was really fun, really exciting, and was full of really cool, epic moments, literally from the first turn. This is probably one of my favourite games of the whole event, if not my favourite, just because of the amount of mad shit that ended up happening in it. Now, my opponent was Ben, and he was running an Eldar pressure list. Now, how his list worked was basically it had loads of bikers. Either they were sniper bikers or they were regular old wind riders, and then they would basically swarm in and try and pin you in your deployment zone for the first few turns. They're pretty durable as far as Eldar units go as well, so they're good at move blocking. And then by the time that you've cleared away through all those 2 wound or 3 wound bikes, there's these 3 Wraith Lords. I think 2 of them are Wraith Seers, one of them the Wraith Lord. They've marched the board. Now they're in your face, blocking you off, doing loads of damage, just really these immovable rocks. And the whole while, you're getting blasted by some swooping hawks. You're getting sniped by 2 or 3 squads of rangers. The mortal wounds are pouring out because he does loads and loads of psychic powers. I think he had a similarly long psychic phase to the Grey Knights, for example, just loads, like 13, 14 casts. And then also there's Dire Avengers as well that are shurikening you. So the whole time that you're dealing with these push units, there's these shooter units behind that are just raking your lines with a really high volume of fire. So it's a really, really good tactic, really sound list. Now, the mission we were playing is Death and Zeal, which is a 5 objective game, and it's table quarters deployment. So it did mean that we were able to once again take advantage of the ruins that were in our deployment zones, and that meant that both of us were actually able to hide a surprisingly large amount of our forces. I rarely had any infantry that were exposed, if any, and the bit of infantry that I did have that he could see was just chilling out in the dense terrain with a nice -1 to hit. Can't really go wrong with that. Now, my deployment was very slightly different to the last one, just because even though I was able to hide everything behind ruins, there was only 2 in my deployment zone this time, which meant that I formed these 2 big 90-man blocks, essentially, rather than 3 smaller 60-man squads. Ben, likewise, also stacked up all of his bikes, essentially, behind the 2 big ruins, but he did forward deploy a couple of ranger units. Now, this was kind of funny because I didn't expect him to forward deploy them, and when I saw where he'd put them, I said, "Are you sure you want to put them there, mate? Because I might charge them turn 1. He went, no, it's fine. Like, you know, it's guard melee versus Eldar melee. I'm sure it'll be all right, and you've got to get there, haven't you, man?" I said, I am pretty quick, and he was like, "Yeah, no, it'll be fine." So I don't think he expected me to do a turn 1 bayonet charge, and I don't think he expected my guys to be quite as quick as they were. I also think that he was kind of hopeful that he'd get turn 1, so he'd be able to sort it out if it had gone a bit squiffy. As it turned out, I got first turn, and I played it really cagey. I just went, right, I'm going to raise a banner on my backfield objective, and then I'm going to keep most of my infantry behind these ruins, but what I'm going to do is take 20 infantry from the left flank, 20 infantry from the right flank, and I'm going to move them forward, and I'm going to take out those ranger squads, because the thing is, he had forward deployed one of the ranger squads, where most of my Krieger infantry was, and they were sitting on an objective, and I knew his plan was to basically sit them on the objective and have me forget about them, whilst all of his pressure comes in, and by the time I've dealt with this pressure and I've remembered there's even rangers behind there, it's too late, he's already scored a shitload of primary, right? And the idea is he was going to do that on both flanks. So I was like, well, can't let him do that, you know, and also, if there's an opportunity for a turn 1 bayonet charge, by the God Emperor, I'm going to do a turn 1 bayonet charge, because there's one faction that I'm pretty confident I can beat the snot out of in combat. It's Eldar. So on the right flank, I sent 2 squads down, and they had fixed bayonets, because he had deployed 9 inches away from my deployment zone, which meant that it was only, you know, with my 7-inch move, it was only a 2-inch charge to get to him. Now, the other unit of Eldar were a little bit further away, so I sent 2 squads up there, and I gave them the move order, but I just used it for the 2-inch extra movement. I didn't use it for the auto advance. That meant that they were able to go 9 inches in a turn, which meant that each one of those squads only had like a 6 or 7-inch charge. It really wasn't that bad, and I sent 2 squads up, so if one failed, the other one would be fine. As it turned out, I made all of my charges. I rolled really well on all of my charges. I got like 8 or more on all the charges, which was really nice. And turn 1, I fixed bayonets. They don't like Upham, sir. They don't like the taste of Mordian steel. And I literally bayonet charged. I sent 20 men after one 5 and Eldar squad, 20 men after another 5 and Eldar squad, even with a cheeky little lightning fast reflexes. It was not enough, and both of those Eldar units were drowned beneath bayonets and balls. Now, I've got to be honest with you guys, the main reason I did it is because I thought it was funny, but looking back on it, it was an accidental, quite savvy move by me, because it meant that he had to then redirect forces to take those objectives back and hold them, which meant less forces that he could commit to his big pin me in place maneuver game plan. And that's exactly what happened. So he ended up sending 2 Wraith Seers and a down one flank with a Farseer, and then he sent another Wraith Seer or Wraith Lord with the Dire Avengers down another flank, and in his turn 1 he did clear all of those creeps. Not fair enough, you know, good job by him, but he wasn't holding either one of those objectives going into his turn 2, which was interesting. And then he sent loads of his bikes forward. He probably committed about 2/3 of his bikes into pinning me into my deployment zone. So it was a lot of bikes that he sent in, and his plan was to try and move block me and snipe at my characters. He ended up picking up the Primaris Psyker because it was like the one character you could see. I really wasn't that bothered. And then he also killed maybe another 15 infantry from the squads that were hiding behind the ruins. The Kriegers did pretty well. They absorbed a lot of the damage. He didn't actually wipe out any squads. He sort of killed 5 men from each squad, and then I just happened to pass the majority of my leadership check, so that wasn't really a problem. Medic saved me 3 or 4 guys this turn, which was pretty nice. And then it kind of swung back to me, and I was like, right, you've committed and exposed a huge amount of your army. I mean, there's like 30% of your bikes are like still hanging back, but the rest of them have just gone sort of all in on me. And I can see your Wraith Lords and everything. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to go for a big turn 2. I'm going to go for it. Normally I try and play a little bit more conservatively, but I'm just going to go for a big turn 2. And oh my God, guys, it was a really big turn 2. I killed all of his bikes that were exposed. I killed one of his Wraith Lords. I killed his Dire Avengers. Everything that I could see, I killed, basically. I think by the end of my turn 2, he must have lost 50% of his army. But at that point, he must have lost 50% of his army. So he was in a really, really tricky spot. And he realised his face fell when my shooting phase started, and he had this unit which he called like his unkillable Wraithseer. I don't know why it was unkillable, because one unit of Scions killed it without really even trying, and he said to me, no one has ever killed that Wraithseer in one go before. He said no, it just doesn't happen. And I was like, oh wow, like that's pretty crazy. When the fact that you did it with one squad is insane. And I was like, I'm sorry, man. I just sort of saw it. It was there, and I sort of shot it with my Scions. He went, yeah, those Scions are really, really powerful. He was like, yeah, I see what you mean when you say Scions are better than Kazakin. So that really, I would say my turn 2, I shock and awed him a little bit. I would say my opponent was definitely a little bit voodooed. Nice guy, wasn't a dick in any way, shape or form, but it definitely made him go like, whoa. And it definitely sort of threw a bit of a curveball at him. Now, what was really, just to give an example of how good my opponent was and a testament to his skill, he didn't do what I thought he was going to do. When I pull the big shock and awe on most players, they end up going cagey and retreating and being like, no, I can't take that again. I've got to protect my little models. And my opponent was like, no, if I do that, I'm just going to end up losing the game and just getting picked off here and there. So my opponent actually went all in. He went proper balls to the wall. He went, right, I'm sending everything I've got left into a big turn 2 mega push. Every bike, every striking scorpion, even the swooping hawks, everything pushed forward, shot the crap out of me, and then charged in. And he did a huge amount of damage. Bear in mind, he must have killed like 60 infantry in his first turn. He must have killed pretty much all of my remaining Kriegers turn 2. And even done there's like a few scraplets left here and there. And he'd even done, killed a Kazakin squad as well. So he'd done really well. And he absolutely responded in the right way, which was he didn't fall back and then inevitably lose by just getting out attrition. He was like, if the guard are going to smash me, I've got to hit them so hard that they can't do a big turn on me. But the problem is that the majority of the infantry that he could realistically get his hands on were my screening units, like my Kriegers. And so it came round to my turn 3, and he's gone all in with everything, and he's doing a good job of pinning me into my deployment zone. I've not really got out of it all that much. I've got a bit up, one of the flanks, but not really got out of it all that much. But he's gone all in. And my Scion Deathball is 80% intact, and my Kazakin are 80% intact. And my Dreadnought is untouched. And so what I do is I catch him by surprise. I decide that I'm not going to fall back and shoot. What I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to end it here and now. And I tell all of my guys, every single one of them, to fix bayonets. Now, the reason I do that is because I knew that if I fell back, that I wouldn't be able to, I'd be losing ground, firstly, and secondly, that there was a third wave coming in. And I knew I had the shooting to deal with one wave, but probably not the third wave. The third wave being these remaining Wraithseers and these Striking Scorpions and stuff. Like, the third wave, you know, I had to deal with his turn. I couldn't let him have a turn 3, pin me in one more turn. I couldn't do that because I'd fall too far behind on primary and stuff. So what I did is I was like, right, I'm going to shoot the stuff that's coming in as the third wave. It's not that much, you know. It consists of like a warlock on bike and a couple of wraith lords, and a squad of striking scorpions. I'm going to shoot that stuff behind, and then I'm going to charge the swooping hawks, the seer council, Eldrad, and the bikes. That's what I'm going to charge. And let me tell you, Kazakin with 2 attacks each, with brutal strength, rerolling ones to hit, rerolling ones to wound, with fixed bayonets, are lethal against Eldar. And I basically, going into his turn 3, he had like a Wraith Seer left and a Fire Seer sat on an objective, and that was it. That was realistically it. So that was, and so he, you know, the game, you know, we easily, you know, he did his turn 3, and then of course it was a simple case of me getting to, you know, to basically scoring points turn 4, turn 5. I by the way, in both games, guys, for my secondaries, I'd taken boots on the ground and flexible command and banners, so I was able to run around the last few turns, you know, finally raising banners. I got myself up to a decent score on all of that, and the final score actually came in at 87 points to the guard and 84 points to the Eldar. So it was a really close game, and if I hadn't gone for that dual maneuver of both shooting and charging, I probably wouldn't have pulled the win off. But it was so cool, and it was so cinematic for me, because it was literally, just as the Commissar says, it was a bayonet with some guts behind it that carried the day, and it was so cool. And when I say it was a full bayonet charge, I mean everyone. My Watchmasters, my Marshals got involved, both Command Squads got involved, all the Scions, all the Kazakin, everyone charged in, and we literally swept the Eldar away underneath a tide of boots and bayonets. It was really, really, really cool, and it was very, you know, it was very cinematic. It was like that scene in Gettysburg where they're like, we're hurting, they must be hurting too. We've got no ammo left. Bayonets! It was literally like that. So it was it was a really cool game, really fun, really thematic, and it actually meant that I won the game, which was really cool. And probably my favourite moment of the game was when the 2 favourite moments was when the Dreadnought absorbed a charge from a unit of striking scorpions, and then Nork turned around and beat the snot out of them single-handedly, and he did a final headbutt to the striking scorpion exile, which was hilarious. And then another bit that stood out for me was when my Sound Command Squad went into combat, and my Sound Commander rolled to hit with his power sword, and he rolled 3 6s, and because Sounds get exploding 6s to hit in combat and in shooting, he went from having 3 hits with his power sword to 6 hits with his power sword. He then proceeded to wound with every single one, and he just cut down, like, I think my opponent made like 1/6 invulnerable save. He just cut down like 5 swooping hawks single-handedly. It was so fucking cool. And then the rest of the Scions piled in, and they were able to cut down loads of them. So it was really, again, a great example of how the Scions are actually a really flexible unit, and they're not half bad in combat when they're hitting on 2s, hitting on 3s, and they've got the reroll 1s on everything, and the extra AP. It was actually, once again, the Scions were the men of the match, because if I hadn't had them, I wouldn't have had the firepower to clear the backline and had the combat ability to win the slap fight against the Eldar, because normally Guard vs Eldar is very much an equal fight, but when I've got fixed bayonets and I've got 2 attacks per guy, it's not an equal fight. The Guard absolutely carry that and absolutely win it, and that was a really big lesson learned from me, and it absolutely validated one of the things that I've been talking about, which is that Kazakin and Scions are really good bully units. So with a draw and a win under my belt, I was feeling pretty happy with my performance so far on day number 1. And I was actually particularly happy because I have a bit of a curse. It's a bit of a superstitious thing, but I always seem to throw game number 2. No matter what tournament I go to, whether it's a major, super major, or just a single day RTT, game number 2 is just cursed for me. Either I get a bad matchup, end up playing against one of the best players in the world, or I end up just being a bit silly because I've won my first game and end up just throwing game number 2. But that didn't happen. So I was feeling pretty happy. I didn't really mind what happened in game number 3. I was feeling pretty happy that I'd broken my game number 2 curse. But I went into game number 3 and I faced off against the current 40k competitive meta boogeyman, the Iron Hands Gunline of Death. And guys, it lives up to its name very well, because it just shoots the crap out of you. Now, this was the first game where I felt outgunned, and this was the first game where I would say that the terrain was a bit too open. Now, you might be surprised about that. You might be thinking, Morning Glory, that looks like there's loads of terrain on that board. What the heck are you talking about? Well, there's deceptively little terrain, because if you notice the way the boards are laid out, obviously the pictures all cycle round, guys, but if you notice the way the terrain's laid out, there's essentially 2 channels of terrain that you can move up, but the rest of it, there's these 3 huge firing lanes right down the middle, right down each flank. So however you advance, you're going to be able to get exposed at some point. The terrain isn't overlapping, because often what you find with terrain on these boards is that there's only ever really one clear fire lane, and that fire lane tends to have dents on it. But in this situation, there was 3 very clear fire lanes, nothing that you could do about it. And also, the objectives, by and large, were all very exposed, especially the ones in the middle of the board. Now, considering it was data scry salvage, and that meant you had to hold at least 2 objectives to score any sort of primary points, it was a real problem for my army, because I had limited maneuverability, where I, from terrain piece to terrain piece that I could hop, and I had limited ways that I could hide. Most of the terrain was L-shaped ruins, and unfortunately it meant that it was actually difficult for me to get a cover save. Either I wasn't seen and therefore couldn't be shot, or I was just out in the open. And yeah, and I was outshot. It was just not the board that I wanted to come across Iron Hands on. And unfortunately, the situation went from bad to worse when I won the first turn roll-off. I really didn't want it, because all that turn 1 does is put me in a horrible situation where either I have to play it really cagey, and I barely move out with anything. That will protect my guys, but I'm a slow foot-slogging horde. If I give up a turn of movement, I'm giving up 20% of my maneuverability for the game. And I can't really afford to do that as a foot slogger. So that means it puts me into the second horrible position, which is why I have to move out, and my opponent gets to shoot much more of my army than he should have really been able to. And so, yeah, at every turning point, guys, this game just kept going against me. I struggled to make any saves this game. It was just one of those games where it was always going to be an uphill battle. I needed things to slightly go my way, and unfortunately, at every turn, the dice gods decided that it was not to be. So, I'm not going to tire you out with a blow-by-blow account. Essentially, it was 5 turns of me pushing infantry forward onto objectives, with my main aim being trying to deny my opponent as much primary as possible. And I'll be honest, I almost pulled it off. The final score was 72 points to the Guard and 80 points to the Iron Hands. And at multiple points in the game, I had dropped my opponent down to 0 primary. Okay? And I had scored primary consistently in pretty much every single turn. But the problem was, and literally up until turn 5, I was ahead on points. And then my opponent gets his turn 5, and because he went second, he gets a score at the end of the game. And so he gets a nice 12-point boost which puts the final score at 80 points to the Iron Hands and 72 points to the Guard. Now, if I had had second turn, if I'd gone second, that 12-point swing would have been mine, and I would have been able to get the swing and get the final points and win the game. But like I said, that losing that first turn roll off, or should I say winning it, but by winning I lost, really cost me the game. But at the end of the day, I will take some pride in the fact that my opponent said at the end of the game he's never had to work so hard for 80 victory points, and literally he had beads of sweat coming down his head. It was so funny. So that was the end of game 3, and end of day 1 I'd had a pretty respectable time. I had a win, a draw and a loss under my belt. Not too bad at all. Couple of lessons learned from the first day. I had learned that Scions were just absolutely lethal. They are really, really good. The Scion Death Bolt is an absolutely S-tier tactic. It does tend to step out, delete stuff, and then it draws a lot of heat. You only really get one full power turn from it. But that's alright, because often you don't need more than one full power turn from it. And even if you only end up with one squad of Scions left over after your opponent's done a counter fire onto them, tends to be more than enough at that point. I'd also learned some hard lessons around Raise the Banners. I'd taken Raise the Banners every single game. In fact, my secondaries in my first 4 games of the tournament were Raised Banners, Flexible Command and Boots on the Ground. And I'd struggled to get to double digits with Raised Banners. I had consistently got about 8 or 9 points on it, but I was struggling to get into the 10-point mark. And that was a little bit annoying, because I felt like with my army, I should, if in doubt, be able to stick 90 bodies on 2 objectives and be able to get loads of banner points. But I felt like I was constantly having to push out further. I felt like I was struggling to really lock down 2 objectives in these first games. And I think it was really to do with the matchups that I had. So in that first game, the Grey Knights were really all over me from the get-go. Likewise with the Eldar. And then in that third game, I would have loved to have raised loads of banners. I had them up for a long time. But unfortunately, the objectives were fairly exposed. And so raising the banners was one thing, but keeping them up and not having my opponent gun down most of my infantry and then jump a unit of infiltrators or Vanguard Veterans Assault Marines on there was another thing entirely. So I did stick with banners for one more game going into game 4, but after that I did start switching up some of my secondaries. And with that said, let's get into game number 4 of day 2. Another glorious day in the Guard. Every day in the Guard is like a day on the farm. Every paycheck a fortune. Every meal a banquet. Every formation a parade. I love the Guard. And we started off day number 2 right by playing against some smelly boys. We played against the Death Guard. It was kind of Guard versus Guard action, except for one of the Guard armies had turned up with spiffy uniforms and an industrial amount of melter guns, and the other Guard army had turned up with very smelly uniforms and a lot of flesh mowers. So, yes, it wasn't really a Guard versus Guard match, but I have to say it was a very interesting game because both armies played in a very similar manner. You see, one of these armies is made up of soulless killing machines marching inexorably forward into enemy fire, heedless of the casualties, fearless in the face of the foe. And the other army is the Death Guard. And it was essentially, guys, 2 immovable objects slowly moving towards each other until they just crashed against each other. And it was a true battle of attrition. This is one of my favourite games of the tournament. My opponent was an absolutely fantastic chap called Kyle. Really nice guy. And he loves his Death Guard. He's a Chaos player through and through. He's got Death Guard. He's got Thousand Suns. He's getting his World Eaters up now that their new book's coming out. And his army was actually really interesting, and he had 3 Plague Burst Crawlers. Now, I know on the surface Plague Burst Crawlers aren't seen as very good, but when you take 3 of them, their firepower actually becomes something you can't ignore. He had a big 10-man block of Blightlord Terminators. Can't complain about that. He had 2 units of Deathshroud Terminators. They're really good as well. And then he also had 3 big units of Poxwalkers. He was very good at using the Poxwalker resurrection trick, where for like 1 CP you can bring back up to 7 of them and stringing them out so that you can take objectives of the enemy. He was very good at that. He had to be very careful. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he also had 3 of the plague drones with the flesh mowers, which against my army on paper was really good because obviously they're great for mowing down light infantry. Now, the mission was Tide of Conviction, which is a 6 objective mission, and another mission where you've got to hold at least 2 objectives to be able to score any kind of primary points, which is really, frustrating. Now, for my secondaries, I continued with banners, inflexible, and boots, and I actually had a really good feeling about banners and boots and inflexible on this map because there were 3 objectives that were actually relatively close to my side of the board, and it was normal Dawn of War long table edge deployment, which allowed me to finally start spreading out my ranks, finally starting to mass my platoons into more than just these 3 little blobs. I was able to really, put my guys on the line, and especially considering that my opponent didn't have a huge amount of firepower. It's some Plague Burst crawlers and then a unit of Blight Lords, but really, I'm for once not facing just horrendous turn 1, just blow you off the table kind of guns, right? This means that I can be a little bit ballsy with my deployment, and what I end up doing is deploying pretty much everyone on the line. I had 2 ruins in my deployment zone. The one on the left, I stuck all the Kazakin behind. The one in the centre, I put all the Scions behind, and then all of my Kriegsmen just deployed on the line in essentially 3 groups of 40 blokes. 1 unit on the right hand side and then 2 units roughly in the centre. And I just figured, you know what? I'm just going to march forward. I'm going to keep marching forward, keep pushing forward, keep putting pressure on my opponent, and I'm going to grind him down. I'm going to wear him out, and I will eventually break through because I know that I actually have more men than him. So even if I lose, 60 men and then followed by another like 30 or 40 men, I know that eventually I will be able to grind through, and he's going to stop being able to stop me at every point. Because he can, if he spreads out to meet me, he can delay me and he can stop me in my tracks for a while, but inevitably my superior numbers are going to win out. Well, at least that is the plan anyway. Now, my opponent ends up deploying in 3 little castles. On the left flank, his left flank, he has 3 of the Plague Mowers and 2 of the Plague Burst Crawlers. On the centre, he has the Demon Prince and his big, huge unit of Blight Lord Terminators. And then he has his one big unit of Poxwalkers on the right flank, and then the other 2 strung out in the middle. My opponent ends up going first. He pushes forward aggressively with his Poxwalkers, trying to take as much of the ground as possible. He's a slow army as well, so like me, he has to make use of every movement phase he's got. He does play it cagey with his Blight Lords and his Demon Prince. He doesn't expose them yet. He's essentially pushing the Poxwalkers out to see what my firepower's like, and then he's going to decide whether he wants to be really aggressive with his Blight Lords if it's not that big, or if he can, afford to essentially have to be a bit cagey with them and maybe use them to dominate one flank rather than just march them down the centre. He moves forward with his Plague Mowers, and he essentially hops them from one piece of cover that's in his deployment zone to a big L-shaped ruin that is in the middle of the board, the one that's in the top right of this picture. And he puts them there because that's a really good spot for them, because it means that if I move on to this objective, as you can see I have done, his Plague Mowers are going to come out and just hoover up all those guardsmen, at least on paper. But the thing is that Deathcore Krieg are actually really good against his Plague Mowers, because the mini transhuman really cuts down the amount of damage that he's doing. It doesn't matter if he's reducing me down to toughness 2, mini transhuman all the time. Doesn't care about it. So then also I've got the Medi-Pack on top of that. So when his bloat drones come flying in with their 8 or 10 attacks, however many it is, they hit with a third of them, they wound with a third of them, and then one of those wounds just goes away, and it's oh, you killed 5 or 6 guardsmen. Oh, well, there's still loads on the objective. And I deliberately pushed forward 4 squads onto the objective, so even if he mowed down all 3 squads successfully, there was still going to be 1 squad sat on there. As it turned out, he mowed down 3 squads by half, but he didn't manage to kill any of the squads outright, so that meant that there was still about 25 guardsmen on that central objective, even after he had sent the 3 flesh mowers in. Now that sort of covers my opponent's sort of turn 1, turn 2 shenanigans. In my first turn, I push those 40 guardsmen onto the right flank, and I end up pushing a lot of guardsmen down the centre as well. The Dreadnought and a load of other guardsmen go straight down the centre. And the Kazakin, who I've deployed in a big platoon, I decide they are going to take the left flank. Single-handedly, they are going to lead the way. Kazakin are going to lead the way. And they actually successfully do this. Now, what's really clever about my opponent is that he's strung his Poxwalkers out in such a manner where he's covering multiple objectives, but also means that if I don't wipe a Poxwalker unit out, he is going to string them back onto one of my objectives and potentially deny it from me if he's able to resurrect enough of them with the Dead Walk again. So I've got to be quite careful with how many men I'm putting on the objective, because if I just tow 1 or 2 onto it, he's probably going to steal that objective off me. Also, I have to make sure I kill the Poxwalkers, otherwise they're just going to keep coming back and I'm going to be wasting my time. So my first turn consists essentially of pushing 40 blokes onto each objective, making sure there's no way he could take it off me in the middle ground, and then also raising banners on all of those objectives. And that was the first wave, and setting up to make sure that my second wave was in a good position to counterattack the inevitable zombie horde and the flesh mower pain train. My turn 2, my opponent had come out the flesh mowers, and I decide, right, I'm going to introduce this guy to some scions. And I send 2 squads of scions, just 2 squads of scions, after the flesh mowers. And I pick both of them up without any problem whatsoever. I then also proceed to pick up an entire unit of Poxwalkers using a single squad of scions. Thanks to exploding 6s, thanks to hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, thanks to wounding with plasma on 2s, rerolling 1s, thanks to the volley guns wounding on 4s, rerolling 1s, just cutting through them, and thanks to the fact that I had put overcharged lad cells on them, which meant that I was getting loads of mortal wounds off. So I got 6 mortal wounds off with overcharged lad cells, and the Poxwalkers don't get their feel no pain because I'm in range of the big bullshit banner. And 10 scions pick up 20 Poxwalkers without even breaking a sweat. It was, again, just such a demonstration of their firepower. You see why at the beginning of the video I said my scions were the men of the match, because 3 squads of scions picked up 20 Poxwalkers and 3 flesh mower drones with change. My Kazakin had also spent 2 turns moving down that left flank, and they had been whittling away at some Poxwalkers, but my opponent was very savvy and he was making sure he was taking casualties, so I was struggling to get all of their firepower to bear. But also, in my turn 2, I decided to be a bit cheeky and force my opponent's hand, and I threw a couple of units of my infantry really far up the board to actually start messing around with his objectives that were out in no man's land but more towards his deployment zone. Meaning that my opponent, if he decided to commit his Blight Lords, would have to deal with the infantry contesting the objective rather than shoot the Kazakin behind, who aren't really in any position to threaten his primary points at that stage. One final thing to mention from these couple of opening turns is I had really messed up my opponent's plans with his Nightshroud Terminators. Because I had the Superior Tactical Training Command Squad, I was able to comfortably get Remain Vigilant on 3 infantry squads turn 1 and turn 2, which meant that my opponent's Nightshrouds turn 3 were forced to come in, but they still needed to stay 12 inches away, which meant that for the first 3 turns of the game, his Nightshroud Terminators did absolutely nothing. I think he spent a CP to try and make their hand flamers a little bit better, but apart from that, they literally did nothing for the first 3 turns of the game, just by stopping them from able to deep strike in and get that charge off. It was really, really potent, and a great example of why the Superior Tactical Training Command Squad is so versatile and so useful. So in the opening 2 turns of the game, my opponent had gone in with his flesh mowers. I'd beaten them back. I had thrown some infantry squads forwards. My opponent had beaten them back. We were sort of getting the measure of each other. Then it came down to my opponent's turn 3, and he decided to do the big commit, the big push. So he brought his 10 Blight Lord Terminators out, and he started getting them into the party. And he was really laying down the firepower with them, and he was picking up a lot of infantry. But he was going across dense terrain a lot of the time, which reduced their firepower significantly. And even though at times I was in contagion range, it didn't matter because of mini transhuman. And the fact that he's AP dash on his bolters and the fact that I've got Kree Medic really meant that a lot of his firepower was sort of just bouncing off. He did do a decent amount of damage though, and in his turn 3 he pushed forward with nearly all of his Poxwalkers, and he actually managed to take me off one of my objectives, meaning that I was only holding 2 objectives at the beginning of my turn 3, which meant I was only getting 4 primary points that turn. But as we all know, the guard gets hit hard, but they hit back even harder. And my turn 3 counter push really sealed the deal and allowed me to comfortably gain the lead in the game. Because despite the fact my opponent had done a good job of whistling down my Scions in his turn 3, he had not touched my Kazakin. Literally hadn't done any damage to them. And I think he'd been lulled into a false sense of security because my Kazakin had been marching up, firing some pot shots, clearing a few Poxwalkers here and there, but that was really it. But now they were all in position to get into rapid fire range of his Blightlord Terminators. And in one turn, 3 units of Kazakin killed nearly every single Blightlord. I killed 8.5 Blightlord Terminators in one go. That was outside of the range of the big bullshit banners. My opponent was reducing damage by 1 against all my plasma, but he just had this one roll where he had to make 8 4-up invulnerable saves, and he only made 1 of them, and it just really took a big chunk of the squad away. And then the rest of the Scions were able to pile in, and it was just really, really potent. I was able to use overlapping fields of fire to get them the reroll wands, even though there was no command squad banner nearby. And it just meant that by deleting those Blightlord Terminators, my opponent really didn't have much left in the game at that point. I actually finished off after deleting the Blightlords in shooting, I ended up having a bit of firepower to trim down the Poxwalkers again, and then I finished them off with a Kazakin with Brutal Strength charge, which actually destroyed his remaining Poxwalkers, wiped them all out by turn 3, and then I took his objective off him, and I was able to move a squad onto another one of his objectives, which meant, despite the fact in my turn 3 he'd taken me down to 4 primary, in my turn 3 I had taken him down to 0 primary going into his turn 4. And in fact my opponent scored no primary points turn 4 or turn 5. And at the end of battle round 3, I still had my 30 Kazakin. I still had about 50 to 60, I'd say 60 Death Corps Krieg. I still had the Dreadnought, and I still had about 10 Scions left. And my opponent had 6 Nightshroud Terminators, the Demon Prince, and then the 3 Plague Burst Crawlers who were at the back of the board just shooting me. But in terms of front line units, it was really the Demon Prince and 6 Nightshrouds. That was it. And so my opponent says, let's play out turn 4 and see how it goes. Turn 4, Nightshrouds finally get into the fight. They chop up one flank, but I don't need that flank at this point. I don't need that objective. It doesn't matter to me. And in my turn 4, the Nightshrouds end up falling over due to all my firepower, my big bullshit banner, and all that good stuff. And the Demon Prince goes down. And so literally going into my opponent's turn 5, all he has is 3 Plague Burst Crawlers. And so we just talk out the final points, and that's it. And it's actually a pretty convincing win by the Guard. We get into the high 80s. We don't quite get into 90 points. My opponent had managed to keep me down a little bit on primary, and I hadn't quite maxed out banners. But I essentially get about I think it's about 88 points I get in game 4, and my opponent gets 59, 60 points. So it was a pretty big win for the Guard in that game. Little side note here, but my opponent made a really astute observation, which was unintentionally I had built a list that perfectly countered Death Guard, because basically none of his army special rules were in effect this game. His Poxwalker, 6 up feel no pain, doesn't matter, I've got the big bullshit banner. His ability to reduce damage, doesn't matter, big bullshit banner counters that. And the fact that his contagions mean absolutely nothing against the Krieg, because he's already wounding me on 3s most of the time, and getting up close and personal and reducing me down to toughness 2 means nothing, because I am mini transhuman all the time. So with day number 2 off to a flying start, it was time to get into game number 5. Now normally this would be the last game of the tournament, but we're playing a 6-round event, which means there's one more after this. I'm not going to lie, there was a small psychological battle that had to be overcome going into this game, and especially going into game number 6. Because normally game number 5 is that one when you can just chill out, not worry about it too much. Especially for me, myself and my opponent are rarely in a position to win the tournament when it gets to this stage of the game. We've obviously lost 1 or 2 at some point. And so we tend to have just a bit of a fun one with game number 5. But in this case, there was still game number 6 to play. So game number 5 was actually quite important because it meant that if you did quite well in it, you could end up with a pretty respectable final score. So it was all to play for, and after I ended up crying in my car for 5 minutes and going, oh my god, there's another game of Warhammer after this, I steeled myself and I got into the final game. Now, clearly, between day number 1 and day number 2, some sort of warp portal had opened up because it was another Chaos game. This time, it was against the Demons. We had seen off the Dark God's mortal followers, and now it was time to send their children back into the abyss from whence they came. And when you need some demon smiting, don't bother with the Grey Knights. They're too busy mind-wiping people and killing all the sisters of battle. You call in the Imperial Guard. Now, the mission for game number 5 was tear down their icons. Clearly, a very thematic mission for the game we were playing, because it was demons and Imperium, and the Guard were trying to tear down the icons of the Chaos Gods, and the worshippers of Khorne and Tzeentch and Nurgle and Slaanesh were all there trying to, smash the Aquila. It was just so right having this mission with this matchup. And on this board, look at this Demon World board that we're playing on. It's just everything just lined up for a really fun, competitive, yet also thematic game. Now, my opponent, Joe, was a lovely bloke. One of the most laid back and chill people I've ever come across during wargaming. Considering some of his dice rolls were pretty horrendous. Clearly, he's not been sacrificing enough people to his Dark Gods. He did not get flustered at any point whatsoever, and truly was a pleasure to play against. So Joe, thank you so much for the incredible game if you do end up watching this video. Also, I want to say a shout out to Joe for having one of the most crazy wacky lists that I've seen in a long time. I don't play against a lot of demons, but when I do, it always seems to be like 4 or 5 of the big mega demons, and then there's like Be'lakor in there. You never seem to see some of the other bits out there. But Joe was actually running a demons list that had 3 soul grinders. I haven't seen a soul grinder in a long time. They are tough old brutes. They start off at toughness 8, but then you can make them toughness 9 with like a mark of Nurgle or something. And wow, toughness 9 really makes me appreciate how good the Rogal Dawn is with its toughness 9. He also then had 3 demon princes. 1 of Khorne, 1 of, I believe it was Nurgle, and 1 of Tzeentch. And then he had 3 units of flamers, and that was probably the most sort of traditionally competitive part of this. I'm not saying his other parts of this weren't good. They were very, very good. I'm just saying when I saw the 3 units of flamers, I was like, oh yeah, of course. 3 units of flamers, staple of any demon's list, of course, of course. And then he had a few other little bits, like he had 1 unit of Slaanesh, Demonettes, 1 unit of the Pink Horrors, and 1 unit of the Screamers of Tzeentch, which again, you don't see Screamers very often. So deployment for this game was diagonal. So it's almost like table quarters, but you've got a little bit more room on either one of your flanks. I do really like diagonal deployment. The terrain for this map had lots of overlapping terrain on the flanks, and there was a bit of dense in the middle as well. It did mean that there was a bit of a killing zone in the middle of the board, but at least that dense, in theory, should have helped balance that out a little bit. Of course, with my big bullshit banner ignoring to hit modifiers, the dense terrain was doing me a lot of favours, and it was doing basically nothing for Joe, which is obviously a bit of a tricky situation that he's going to have to work around. Now, in terms of my physical deployment, I put my Scions behind the big L-shaped ruin as a tradition that was in the back of my deployment zone. They don't need to get too up close and personal. They've got a maximum 24-inch range. And my thinking is that Joe is inevitably going to have to push out onto that middle objective, and therefore having 30 Scions essentially overwatching that is perfect. I then, on the small L-shaped ruin that was on my sort of top left of the deployment zone, I deployed my 30 Kazakin, and then I had another small L-shaped ruin that was on the right-hand side, which I deployed the Dreadnought and a bunch of about 60 Krieg infantry behind. And then I had about 60 Krieg infantry left, and I used one squad to cover my deployment zone for anyone trying to drop in like a sneaky beaky boy. And then I put the other remaining, and then I put 20, I think about 40 other Krieg infantry just on the left flank and in the centre. So I had a pretty continuous line of infantry across my deployment zone, and I really was feeling confident in this game because I had a objective that was bang in my deployment zone that my Scions and my Sentinels could happily sit on most of the game until they were called upon to purge the central objective. I had I had easy access to a second objective up on the left-hand flank, and then I could quite easily jump onto a third objective. Obviously, I could access the middle objective, but you see the L-shaped ruin that's in sort of the bottom centre now, where you see where the Dreadnought is. That's a really nice ruin for me, because it means I can shove 60, all this infantry you can see here, I can shove all that infantry into that ruin, and I am in position to hop onto two objectives, the middle one, and also my opponent's one that's in the top right of the board. So it's a really nice ruin there. So my plan was basically shove 60 infantry into that ruin as quickly as possible, and then just every turn hop a squad or two out and take either my opponent's objective off him or start contesting the middle objective. It was as simple as that. Now, my aim in this mission was to really dominate on the primary game, because my opponent, his list was kind of weird because his Demon Princes did a lot of damage but were incredibly fragile, and his Soul Grinders did fuck all damage but were incredibly durable. But I feel like the problem with that was that I just literally did, once the Soul Grinders had fired at me once and I got the measure of them, I just did not fear them, like, at all. And their damage output was so negligible that honestly, if they hadn't been such massive models, I would have not been able to tell you they'd even been on the board. And a lot of that was because they were often shooting across that dense. They were then slamming into my mini transhuman, and then if they did get a couple of wounds through, one of those wounds would just go away because of the Krieg Medi-Pack. So you had like 3 Soul Grinders unload into a 10-man Death Corps of Krieg and be like, oh, there's still like 3 or 4 of them left. It was kind of bonkers. So yeah, they don't even have that many attacks in close combat either. So they're very, very tough, but they're just there, in my opinion. They're just in the list to distract you. And my plan was essentially to kill everything around them and then deal with them as and when I could. Now, in terms of secondaries, I mixed it up this game. I took Inflexible Command and Boots to the Ground, of course, but I also took Assassinate. In hindsight, this was probably one of the missions that taking banners was really, really good on, but my opponent had 3 Demon Princes and he had Fate Weaver, and I knew that his Demon Princes were his main damage dealing, and I knew that he could not afford to, if he was played it really cagey and didn't commit his Demon Princes, I knew that whilst I might not get many points on the secondary Assassinate, that I would be able to roll up his army very easily, no problems whatsoever, because there'd be no threats to me, especially after I worked out the Soul Grinder's damage output was fairly minimal. So I took Assassinate, and this is when I've done my video on good secondaries, the best secondaries, the game-winning secondaries, I put Assassinate in there because Assassinate is one of those ones that can really mess with your opponent's plans, because he wants to do damage to you with his turbo characters, but if he does, he's going to give points up. And especially against my army, if he sends one of those Demon Princes in, flies it in against a bunch of infantry, even if he kills 20 infantry, 30 infantry with it, it's fine. I will sacrifice 3 squads of infantry to score secondary points. That's not a problem whatsoever. So my opponent gets first turn and he flies forward on the left flank with his Tzeentch Demon Prince and with a unit of Flamers. And he starts the slow march of his Soul Grinders into the middle of the board. But because it's WTC terrain and they've got such massive bases, their movement corridors are very limited. And so he ends up just over the course of like 2 or 3 turns marching them into the middle of the board, trying to do damage with their battle cannon and autocannon equivalent weapons. I don't even know what they are. I think one's called like Phlegm and another one's like an autocannon of some kind. But anyway, he's like spraying out some shots, but not really doing a huge amount. And meanwhile, I'm just playing on the flanks. I'm not even engaging in the centre of the board. My scions don't come out to play until turn 2, turn 3. And so Soul Grinders, over the course of the game, march into the middle of the board. You can see them there. They're moving forward, going down those middle channels, trying to get onto the main board. He's got Demon Prince of Nurgle and Fate Skimmer going with them. And then on my left flank, he's got the Tzeentch Demon Prince and the Flamers coming down there. And on my right flank, he's got a unit of Demonettes that are able to tow onto the objective. They can only get like 2 people onto the objective without exposing himself. Obviously, he doesn't want to expose himself to my firepower. And then he's also got a Khorne Demon Prince that's kind of hanging around there, threatening it. And he's also got a unit of Flamers, which he's using to cover that objective. This is the one that is, from your picture right now, on that top left there. So that's how my opponent set himself up, and he's pushing down the top flank there, and he's sort of covering the middle, his home objective, and the one on my right flank. Now, my counter to this is on the left flank, where he's put his Flamers and his Tzeentch Demon Prince. I'm like, fuck it, I'm going to shoot that Demon Prince to death, and then I'm going to charge those Flamers. Because they don't auto-hit anymore, and they're not very good in combat. So in my opponent's turn 1, he comes forward, he manages to like he does a spell that like does loads of mortal wounds. It like affects one squad, and then it starts doing D3 mortal wounds to all the squads around it. He ends up picking up like 20 guardsmen with like this one spell, doing a pretty good job. I'd bunched up a little bit too much. And then that was basically his turn 1, getting in position on those middle objectives and then, doing some mortal wounds to me. My first turn, I'm like, right, take the damaged infantry squads that got all the mortal wounds, push them up against the Flamers, use the ruins so that they can't overwatch me, and then get a couple of squads and a Kazakin squad round with an angle. So I'm going to have to move them. So I'm only going to be hitting on my basic ballistic skill, but that's fine. And let's take that Demon Prince out, because at the end of the day, the Demon Prince, it's only got like 8 or 9 wounds. Now, what's really interesting here is my heirloom weapons was really clutch in this situation, because I was able to not only, and my Swift of the Wind was really clutch, because I was able to get my melter guns just about into melter range, full-blown melter range. The reason that was so important was because normally my melter range would only be like a 6-inch, but because of heirloom weapons, my melter range was an 8-inch range. I fired 4 melter guns at my opponent. I did really well on my hits. I got all 4 melter guns to hit. This is from 2 different squads. The first squad, my opponent made both 4-up saves. The second squad, my opponent failed both 4-up saves. And I rolled a 3 and a 2 for the damage. Now, normally, that would have been 5 damage and the Demon Prince would have been alive. But because I was in melter range, that was 9 damage and the Demon Prince just went back to the warp. It just died. So that was really that was a really good example of just how clutch combining move, Swift as the Wind, and heirloom weapons was. And then I didn't even need the Kazakin. I then had the Flamers in front of me, and I charged a little 5-man squad that was out of line of sight into them first. Then I charged 2 more 5-man squads into them that were right in front of them, and was able to get those in as well. And then I had a 10-man squad that had about a 9-inch charge, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll make it, maybe I won't. I rolled the dice, and it came up as a double 6. And I was like, yes, fucking boxcars, let's go! 2 Commissar faces. The Commissar clearly wants me to drive these demons back. And so I ended up swarming these Flamers with about 25, 30 guardsmen. And even though I'm only hitting on 4s, because I hadn't fixed bayonets with anyone, I needed the extra movement to get these charges off, I was able to just do due to a few lasgun shots, I whittled a few down, and also due to just a lot of bayonet attacks, and the fact they've only got a 6-up demon save in combat, I was actually able to bring these demons down to only 2 of the original starting 5. And this maneuver had completely bamboozled and caught my opponent off guard, because he just assumed the guardsmen would naturally get into a firefight with him. Why would they bayonet charge? I mean, guard are not a combat army. And so he was sort of expecting for my guardsmen to eventually just get flamed off the board, or maybe his Flamers would grind me down, but they were going to pin me in place and they were going to cover that objective the whole game, right? But by bayoneting them, that forced them to fall back with them turn 2, and then I followed them up again with another bayonet charge, so they had to fall back in his turn 3, and then I chased them across the board with this like 30-man platoon, and I eventually turn 3, I bayoneted and lasgunned down the last one. And I literally, this unit of flamers, which should have been the perfect counter to my guardsman squad, were harried and hounded and driven before this infantry platoon, literally at bayonet point. It was so fucking cool, boys. And the crazy thing is I actually really got a long way up the board. I got a really long way up the board. Starting off in this picture right now, starting off the bottom hand left corner where that objective is, I ended up at the top left where my opponent's objective is. I literally ended all the way up there just by moving and charging and moving and charging. And it was a really aggressive push that eventually my opponent had to direct another squad of flamers over there. So he basically had to use 66% of the flamers he had in his army to finally shut down that push. And he needed to do that because by the time the Great Bayonet Charge had finished, I still had about 15 guardsmen making the push. I think I've thrown another 10-man squad in to help continue the momentum. And that's 15 guardsmen, which are then right in a position to take his home objective off him. And the only thing holding his home objective was 10 pink horrors. And look, if I can deal with 5 flamers, I can more than deal with 10 pink horrors. So that was kind of the story of the left flank, and it was super cool. And then the story of the right flank was very grim dark. Very, very grim in the dark. So the story of the right flank is one of brutal calculation of pure Krieg numbers, okay? Because basically I sat 60 people, like I said, behind this objective, this one that's in the middle bottom of this picture right now. I sat 60 people behind that objective, and one squad a turn, every turn, moved onto my opponent's objective, and every single turn that denied him 4 primary points, and every single turn my opponent responded by flaming them off and killing them. And so literally I, over the course of 5 turns, expended 50 guardsman lives. I think it was 40 guardsman lives just to deny my opponent 4 primary points a turn. But it was worth it because that, over the course of the game, denied my opponent 16 primary points, which is massive. In hindsight, could I have done like a big push and swept down there? Yeah, maybe. But the idea was it was kind of a Mexican standoff, and I was winning the Mexican standoff. I mean, I can charge down a unit of flamers, no problem, but if I try and charge down a unit of demonettes, even with 20 or 30 guardsmen, they are going to turn around and do a lot more damage back to me. And likewise, there was a unit of demonettes and a unit of flamers holding that objective. So it was, for me, the more ruthless and safe calculation was to move a squad out there every single turn. My opponent could not come onto the offensive against me, because if he did, I had my scions that were sort of hanging back a little bit. I had more infantry that were in the backfield, just screening him off for the first couple of turns. So even if he had gone on the offensive against me, he would have done a bit of damage, but then I would have easily blown him away. So it was basically a Mexican standoff with the guardsmen just running onto the objective one squad at a time. And it must have been so brutal. Like, you could imagine it in real life. The Krieg Marshal just ordering another squad forward, and they just charge over, charge over. And then all you hear is this crackle of warp fire and the screams of gas-masked men dying. And then there's a little pause, and the officer just points to the next squad and just says, go. And then they just run off. They just run, and just one squad after another. So it was brutal, but it was effective, and it meant that my opponent really struggled to get almost any primary the whole game. Because at the same time, whilst I was doing this to his one of his home objectives, I was also doing a similar maneuver into the center of the board, because my opponent had like 3 soul grinders sat in the center, slowly marching up to the middle of the board. But all I had to do was stick an obsec unit on there every turn, and he didn't get the middle objective point. So when you actually look at it, there's 3 objectives across the middle. On the right flank, I'm denying that to my opponent every single turn with 10 guardsmen. On the left flank, I have driven him away from there and forced him to defend his home objective. And in the middle of the board, I am just moving 10 guardsmen onto the center, for the first 2 turns, just denying him any primary there as well. So my opponent was stuck on 4 primary for pretty much the whole game. And I think one turn he managed to get 8 points. And then one turn he got 0 points. And my opponent's final primary score was only 16. He did really well in his secondaries. Reality Rebels, I think he maxed. I think he also did really well. He maxed out Warp Ritual. And he had a Nourished by Terror, which he maxed as well. So he did really, really well. He almost maxed all of those objectives. He did really well in the secondaries, but his primary was just terrible. 16 points. I ended up maxing out my primary score just because I always sat on 2 objectives. And so by the end of the game, and this was the one where you planted a few bombs. So I planted a bomb or 2, and that meant by the end of the game, I had happily scored well into 45 points. Now, that explains the left flank. That explains the right flank. Now let's talk about the center of the board. This is where the big brawl happened. All right. Now, my opponent marched into the center of the board turn 1 and turn 2 and turn 3. And like I said, I just fed him an infantry squad a turn just to deny him those primary points. But that was, I move block him a bit as well. I did a lot of move blocking as well. Because those big Soul Grinder bases, they can't get round a lot of stuff. Turn 3, I decide to step out. Turn 3, I'm like, right, he's moved far enough forward that I can not only get him with the Scions, but I can also get him with all 3 squads of Kazakin as well. Because my Kazakin had moved up a little bit. They were behind that big L-shaped ruin that's on the left-hand side of this picture. And I jumped out on turn number 3, and I unleashed hell. 60 elite infantry, all would take aim. All with reroll 1s to hit, thanks to my officers being nearby. All with reroll 1s to wound, because I was able to string the big bullshit banner command squad out to them. All with ignoring to hit modifiers. All ignoring field no pay. All of the influence of the big bullshit banner. And it was horrendous. It was probably the most brutal display of firepower I have ever been able to unleash on someone. And those Soul Grinders might have been tough, but they ain't invincible. When you're hitting them with a total of 12 rapid fire plasma guns, and many of those plasma gun shots have got exploding 6s, and the plasma pistols are in range as well, and then you're hitting them with volley guns and hot shot las rifles, and you've got hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, and you're also able to use overcharged las cells on a squad, and you're also able to use Vengeance for Cadia. By the time the dust had settled, 2 Soul Grinders had been toppled over with ease. And I even had enough spare firepower to be able to then target Fate Skimmer, who was now exposed. And I brought him down as well. And my turn 3 just firestorm. Tzeentch thinks he's got a firestorm. Let me tell you, he ain't got nothing on a Scion Deathball. That's a true firestorm. And that turn 3 really decided the game. Like, it was already going my way very much in terms of points. I was doing very well on all my secondaries, very well on all of the primary. It was already very much going my way. But that turn where I just deleted 2 Soul Grinders and I deleted his Fate Skimmer was just like, right, that's it. Or, you know, he's got 2 Demon Princes and a Soul Grinder left that are really active in the game. And he's not done all that much damage to me because he hasn't got any long-range firepower. So he's only killing a couple of squads of infantry a turn, the ones that I'm choosing to feed to him. So that really spelled the end of the game there. And over the course of turn 4, Joe does make a final big play. He moves into the Soul Grinder to the board. He pushes forward with his 2 remaining Demon Princes, trying to really make something happen, a bit like how the Eldar player did. So he did the right thing. But unfortunately, the Khorne Demon Prince bounced off the fully buffed up Dreadnought, because I had that ready to receive that charge. It was the only unit he could realistically get into. And his Nurgle Demon Prince was trying to do loads of like mortal wounds to me and stuff. And unfortunately, it tried to get into a firefight using mine bullets. Turns out real bullets are better than mine bullets. And so I ended up picking up the Nurgle Demon Prince. The Dreadnought Nork Deddog did like 6 wounds to the Khorne Demon Prince and then fell back and shot it in the face with a unit of Scions behind. And by the time we got round to turn number 5, all Joe had left was his 10 pink horrors sitting on his backfield objective. And I just surged forward on all fronts, turns 4, turns 5. So it was a very, very solid win. It ended up being, I maxed out my points, both primary and secondary. I couldn't get quite 100 because I had taken Assassinate and Joe only gave it 13 points to that. But I got 98 points on the game and my opponent Joe got about 66. So still a very respectable score from him. But the problem was he literally sat on 16 points for primary the whole game. I think for 2 turns, or for at least 1 turn, he got 0 primary. I think he got 4 points, 4 points, 0 points, 8 points. And that was how his primary score looked. And he deployed no bombs either. So that was a real strong victory for the Guard in that case. So game number 6 finally rolls around, and it's the last game of the event. Now before we dive into it, let me give you a little bit of context about what was happening at the tournament. When game 6 came along, about half the players dropped from the event. And the reason for this is that it was already getting very late. Round 2 didn't finish until about 4, 5, 6 o'clock. And so most people were like, I don't want to play another 3 hours of 40k. I've still got to get home. I've got to have my dinner or my tea. And then I've got to get up and get ready for work, the next day because it's a Sunday. So a lot of people were like, not bothered about playing round number 6. And so they left. The TOs themselves even said that round 6 was kind of an experiment and they're not going to be doing it going forward because so many people basically dropped out. As a result, round 6 became a little bit of a spare round, and the only people that were really playing it were the ones that were trying to play into the finals and to win the event. Now, I wanted to play out round 6, so I wanted to make sure I had the complete experience for this tournament. But when I got to the table, I sat down, I was a bit tired, I started getting my models ready, and my opponent turned up and he literally slumped into his chair and the guy could barely keep his eyes open. And I involuntarily said, this guy looks so tired, I involuntarily went, whoa, dude, you look absolutely knackered, are you okay? And he said, I am so tired, I wouldn't be playing this game to be honest with you, mate, but I'm getting a lift with one of my friends and he's actually in a position to do quite well at the tournament, so if I'm going to be here for another hour or so, I might as well play the game. And so I saw this guy across the table and he was like, I'm not even going to get half my models out. He's like, I'll just put down what I can bother getting out of my case. That's how tired this guy was. And I was just like, look, dude, why don't we just have a chill one? Let's play the game. Let's play it for as long as your teammate is, your colleague, your friend is playing his game. We'll play 2 or 3 rounds. We'll have it pretty chill. And if there's a clear winner at the end of 2 or 3 rounds, that person can have the win. If there's not, we'll call it a draw. Now, if I was a cutthroat player, I would have forced my opponent to play out all 5 rounds and then try and go for the win and get the best final possible placing that I could do. But at the end of the day, guys, my opponent was a really nice guy. And he was an Orc player. He was an Orc player through and through. It was all he mained. And he had all these cool custom converted Orcs and everything. He painted some of them up with green skin. Some of them had like human skin. Some of them had blue skin. Some had red. It was a really cool army. And what you've got to remember is at the end of the day, guys, there's another human being on the table opposite you. And it's really not good form and not good etiquette to just make someone play out a game that they don't want to play. So what ended up happening is we did end up playing the first 3 rounds of the game, and then his teammate came over and went, oh, by the way, I've been smashed, I'm kind of finished now, I'm not going to be getting into any sort of good final position. And so me and my opponent just called it on round 3. We said, you know what, it's a pretty even game at this point. He's still got a few Squid Hog boys left over. I've still got 20, Sounds left, 20 Kazakhin left over. A lot of my Krieg guys have died. Both armies have taken a similar amount of casualties. No one's been able to hold that central objective the whole game. We've both been sat on 2 objectives the whole game. why don't we just call it a draw there? And I was like, you know what, mate, let's call it a draw. It allows me to go home a little bit earlier, allows you to finally get some sleep. And so that's what we did. We ended up calling it a draw on round number 3. We made sure that we didn't give ourselves some ridiculously high score, like a 100 draw. We didn't want to jib anyone. So we ended up just calling it a 70-point draw on either side, because that's realistically roughly what the points were. I think, you know, I had like 72 and he might have had like 74, or it was maybe the other way around. I can't remember exactly what it was, but we just called it a draw on round 3. Now, the way the game actually was going, guys, if I was to be just brutal for a moment, I do think that I probably would have been pulling it back turn 4, turn 5, because my opponent had got a turn 1 charge on me. I deployed a lot of infantry on the line because I knew I wasn't going to be able to stay away from the Goth pressure list. So I deployed 60 Kriegers on the front line. He'd smashed into that, actually bounced. It turns out that Storm Boys and everything aren't that good into like transhuman humans, and the medics were doing great, and I still got an armor save against a lot of his attacks. So he actually bounced off with his first charge and with the second charge. My Scions and my Kazakin were fairly untouched going into turn number 3. I had cleared away so much. All he had left at the end of his turn number 3 was basically 1 unit of Squighog Boys and his beast boss on the big giant purple squig, and that was it. All his other boys had died. All his other beast riders had died. And his storm boys had died. His commandos had died. And so I had turn 4 and turn 5 to realistically, you know, push out, start really taking the objectives. You know, no prisoners was basically maxed out. Assassinate was going to be maxed out from that point onwards. I'd taken both of those. But like I said, I'd said to the guy at the beginning of the game, look, we'll play 3 rounds. There's no clear winner at round 3. You know, I'm happy to call it a draw if your mate finishes early. And that's exactly what happened. And I'm not the kind of man to make a gentleman's agreement and then go back on it. Now, despite the rather strange nature of game number 6, there was actually some really viable lessons to be learned from it. Firstly, if you're going to get contacted by a turn 1 assault army, and there's very little you can do about it, you might as well deploy on the line with a bunch of sacrificial infantry. The advantage of doing that is it encourages your opponent in, and then it allows your Scion Death Ball and your Kazakin Death Ball to just clear them away. The other thing to mention is that Orks are pretty good in combat, but I was surprised how much he was bouncing. I mean, he charged in with a unit of those Squighog riders, and he said, oh, these things just go through Marines like there's no tomorrow. And then I didn't seem to take that much damage from them. I don't know if my opponent was rolling. He was just rolling a lot of 2s. From what I remember, and he kept being like, oh yeah, that's like 6 wounds, and I'd be like, no, that's actually only 2 wounds, because all those 2s don't count. My mini transhuman was being really clutch. So mini transhuman is really good against all those strength 6 attacks the Orks put out. The medic was great, because my opponent would often like tag as many units as possible and do a few casualties to every squad, but then the medic would kick in and save a lot of them. What was really interesting is that it felt like a combination of the Eldar game and the Demon game. I had the pressure of the Eldar game, but the complete lack of incoming fire like I had in the Demon game. Now, when I say I think I would have won this game overall, I'm not saying that to try and wank myself off and make myself look better. No, not at all. Like, that's not the reason I'm saying it. The reason I'm mentioning it is because if you are a guard player that with infantry that ever ends up going into the Goth pressure list, don't be afraid of it, because it's going to put a huge amount of pressure on you turn 1, turn 2, and probably turn 3. But if you have enough bodies and you have enough firepower, if you can weather those first couple of turns, it's like a brief hailstorm. It hails and hails and hails, and then suddenly the pressure's gone. So that's why I'm mentioning that I think the Pure Infantry Guard could have won it out in the end. I think I could have won the attrition, because my army is designed in this circumstance to be able to absorb the casualties for a couple of turns, out attrition my opponent, and then pull it back turn 3, turn 4, turn 5. But as it was, we called it a draw because at the end of the day, guys, when you get to turn 3 and it's been a pretty equal game the whole way, who knows how round 4 and 5 would have gone. It's a dice game at the end of the day. There's a very strong chance that I would have had a big whiffer. There's a great chance that my opponent might have had an absolute slam dunk a couple of turns. I've not played the Golf Specialist. Perhaps he had more tricks to pull out of the bag. Who knows? And so that's why when we got to round 3, we ended up calling it a draw because my opponent needed to leave at that point. I'd had an absolutely fantastic game, and a bit like with my game number 1, it allowed both players to walk away with a bit of dignity, allowed us to save a little bit of time, and we both had a ton of fun. I want to say a massive thank you to my Orc opponent. He still was able to switch it on when he needed to. He was absolutely an Orc player through and through. He went all in. He was doing the wars and all that kind of good stuff. Absolute top lad. So massive thank you to him for being a great Orc opponent, and thank you for being a credit to the Orc community and for making my final game of the tournament go from being a grueling, tiring slog into a really enjoyable, upbeat finish to the whole event. And so that was the end of the tournament. And I just want to close out this video with some final thoughts and a bit of a summary. The first thing I want to talk about is how did it feel running pure infantry again? Oh my god, it felt so good. It's been a really long time since I ran pure infantry at a competitive event, and this is probably the first time that I ran a proper pure infantry army at a 2-day event in 9th edition. I have run a proper pure infantry army at the beginning of 9th edition, but that was just a 1-day event, and I did run the 365 conscript list a little while ago at the end of the old 8th edition codex, but that was a team tournament. It wasn't a singles event, so it really felt good getting the lads back out on the table, running a themed list, a little bit of a skew list, but not a complete meme list like the conscript one. And it was really good taking it into that competitive singles environment and seeing it perform on the tabletop. There's a really big difference between me playing the battle reports here in the battle bunker and me playing local games down the club or with my friends and actually getting into that competitive scene, competitive meta. It really does make a big difference. The games play very, very differently. So overall, really impressed with how the pure infantry performed. My final score was 3 victories, 2 draws and a loss. If it had been just a 5-round event, like a normal 5-round event, it would have been 3 victories, 1 draw and 1 loss, and that's a very respectable score. Now, in terms of specific things in the list that stood out to me, I have mentioned some of these throughout the video, but I'll just touch on them again. The durability of the Krieg was incredible. The number of times that I lost track of the times that I'd have a few Kriegmen left over where I know if it had been any other kind of infantry, including Kazakh, including Scions, they would have all been picked up. There were turns when I knew I was going to lose 30 or 40 infantry and my opponent thought they were going to kill 60 or 70, and by not getting all the kills they wanted, it often meant I was holding objectives that they didn't think I would have been holding. It meant that my opponent really struggled to allocate their resources efficiently because they'd often misjudge how much it would take. They'd then in the later turn start overcommitting because they knew that they needed to really throw a lot into these Krieg to get rid of them. So I have to say the Krieg really stood out, and they may be the priciest choice in our codex, but if you're for infantry, but if you want a troop choice and you want the best troop choice, I do think they're even superior to Cadian shock troops. They're really, really good, especially in a pure infantry context. If you're running a more hybrid list, I'd probably still stick with the Cadian shock troops, but if you're going pure infantry, you owe it to yourself to start looking at that Deathcore Krieg data sheet. My Scions consistently outperform my Kazakin, but that is probably because the Kazakin weren't really being used in the best possible way. They were basically being used as slightly more expensive line infantry with a bit more firepower, whereas the Scions were being used in their most ideal format the Scion Death Ball. I do think that Kazakin and Scions are both fantastic units, and at the end of the day, I think that both deserve a place in your list, but when you're using your Kazakin, the better way of using them is to have a specific job in mind of them. They are a little bit overpriced if you're just using them as line infantry. Scion Death Ball, incredible. Scions are the men of the match every single game. They killed everything they came across. They really put the fear of the God Emperor into my opponents and consistently showed off why they are the big toy soldiers. And the very last thing I want to mention is I was very pleasantly surprised by how much combat punch my army had. Now, I'm not saying you want to start charging into World Eaters or Blood Angels. No. Those dedicated combat armies will tear you a new one if you try anything like that. But I found that my guardsmen were happily able to wade into combat as well as any other take-all-comer faction. So, for example, in that game number 2, not only was I happy to get into combat, but I actually out-combated the Eldar. And that included things like striking Scorpions when I took them on with the Dreadnought. That included things like the Seer Council when I just buried them under a unit of Scions. You know, I had no issue with getting into combat with my Guardsman equivalent opponents and easily winning those fights. When I went into game number 3 against the Iron Hands, there were a couple of turns when I had to pull off some bayonet charges to deny him some primary points, and I beat the snot out of these couple of 5-man units of Incursors. Had no issue with it whatsoever. And if it hadn't been for my opponent bringing over some of his Vanguard veterans, I actually would have completely wiped them out over the course of a couple of combat phases. So that was really interesting, because normally when I go into Marines with Guardsmen, I don't do any damage to them and they end up just beating me up in combat. But actually, I was able to hold my own against standard Marine infantry, which is a very important lesson in my opinion, something I'm definitely going to be keeping at the back of my mind. Going into game 4, I was able to go toe-to-toe with the Poxwalkers. Poxwalkers normally are actually kind of difficult one for Guard to deal with, but the fact that I'm hitting them on 3s is pretty nice. So that really made a big difference. Game number 5 against the Demons, well, I was able to drive those Tzeentch Demons before me, and I was able to really Barney with them, which was great. And then game number 5, like I said, I surprisingly weathered the Ork Goth pressure, thanks to the fact that I had these durable Krieg infantry that the Orks normally would have been wounding on 2s, but instead they had to wound on 3s. So it definitely felt like I was able to pull off bayonet charges, and it wasn't just a meme maneuver, it actually was a good tactical option and a good tool to have in my toolbox. But that's all we've got time for today. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I know it was a little bit of a longer one. I tried to go into a bit of extra detail in those games that I thought were particularly interesting. And I also, of course, had to cover that 6th game where normally I'm only covering 3 or 5 games at a tournament. But I hope you did enjoy that slightly extended format. If you did, make sure you like the video and also subscribe to never miss an episode. Now, if you really enjoyed today's video and you want to see me go to more tournaments and do more of these after action reports, then please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. The generous support from the members, from the patrons, allows me to go to these tournaments and to do these after action reports and bring the content back to you guys. So if you do like it, please consider going the extra mile and becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. But that's it. That's all I'm going to say. Shameless plug out of the way, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. And of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.